Ladies and gentlemen, the final episode of the meta performance series, The Social Brain. Okay, so neural connections make us who we are. The human brain has 100 billion neurons, and you could argue that it's the neurons or the collective expression of the neurons that make us who we are. Different experiences wire our brain differently. Some circuits can become stronger or weaker depending on which ones are activated. So if you keep using the circuit for, say, using a keyboard, then you get better at using a keyboard. And at the same time, every time you practice something, you're actually weakening all the other circuits. So if you had learned to play a musical instrument 10 or 15 years ago, and you're using a keyboard for maybe the fifth time, then you're actually weakening the circuit for music, right? Even though it's a slight bit, you're still weakening that circuit. So if you want to stay sharp with a skill, you need to keep sharpening them. So just like a knife, if you want to keep yourself in top shape with a particular skill, you need to keep sharpening it all the time. So exercising rationality, which is the ability to take rational decisions, happens by training a particular set of neural connections that can be strengthened in the exact same way, which is through practice. And as we know, as we've learned, one of the best things to do to become successful in the world around you is to become a rational person, right? Which is to try and take a lot of decisions in system 2, even though it might be a lot of effort. You physically modify your brain every time you practice something due to something called neuroplasticity. People used to think in the past that the brain is a set device. Right, you grow into adulthood, the brain grows till then, and that's it. All the folds, the exact pattern of the brain, it stays constant. But that couldn't be farther from the truth. When you exercise something, whether you exercise the ability to play a music instrument or the keyboard or even football, how your legs move when you play football, they're all changing the structure of the brain. So what your brain looks like at the age of 20 and what it looks like at the age of 50 are actually reasonably different, right? So you could actually split a person's brain open at 20 and then at 50, and you could see that they look different. The folds are different. Some parts are strengthened, some parts are weakened over time. So neurotransmitters like norepinephrine put the brain in a defensive state when you feel like your thoughts need to be safeguarded from others. Sometimes we have these thoughts and we say it, and then somebody disagrees with us. And what happens during that period is when somebody disagrees with you, your brain releases a neurotransmitter called norepinephrine, right? And that puts you in a defensive state. So you act like something needs to be protected. Confronted with differences in opinion, an opposing thought from something or someone else triggers a primitive part of the brain that interferes with rational thinking, physically making you narrow-minded. So whenever you feel like your thoughts need to be protected from somebody else, you become narrow-minded and you have tunnel vision. You can only see what you want to see at that point, right? So this is the structure of norepinephrine, and the idea is that a lot of our arguments that we have online, you're constantly in a state of triggering norepinephrine. Not just you, but everybody else who's arguing with you. The brain can't tell the difference between a mental and a physical threat. Words do hurt as much as sticks and stones, right? And this is something that a lot of people, get wrong. We think that it's only physical violence that hurts, but actually mental violence is just as bad. And we need to train our brain to understand this. We need to train our brain that when somebody attacks our thoughts, we are becoming narrow-minded. We are not able to exercise rationality, right? So if we know these things, we are able to monitor them with system 2. Next thing we need to talk about is expression. When we express our views and those views are appreciated, defense chemicals like norepinephrine clear away, improving our self-esteem. Validation from other people improves dopamine and serotonin, which are positive neurotransmitters in most cases, right? Sometimes, these neurotransmitters can also get in the wrong receptors. We're not going to talk about that. But validation, when other people commend you, when other people say, hey, you've done a good job, they listen to your ideas, they work according to the ideas, that improves the levels of these neurotransmitters. By the time we grow up, our idea of what is right and what is wrong is almost entirely environmentally driven. I and you don't have any real original thoughts. From the beginning of the time we were born on the planet. It was started with our parents. It then went on to our schools. It then went on to our friends. We are socially shaped. Today, I'm actually a function of all the content I consume, whether it be the medical content I consume, the design content I consume, the development content I consume. It doesn't matter, right? I become fundamentally a function of that, along with all the people I manage, along with all the investors I work with. So you become an amalgamation of the environment you put yourself into. Our actions are purely driven by the validation, either positive or negative, that we receive from our environment. When we see others perform an action, there is a set of neurons in your brain called mirror neurons that fire as if we were performing the actions ourselves. These neurons can also trigger during imagination, right? So a lot of Olympic athletes, when they want to run a race, they imagine themselves while practicing, they imagine themselves being in the stadium, the crowds chanting, and then they run, right? And that helps a lot because it triggers mirror neurons. It helps them when they're actually on, the track, they remember the imagination exercises that they went through. It's called visualization. It works. Mirror neurons cannot differentiate between itself and others, which is why we are so dependent on validation from others, right? So, as you can see on this image on the left, there is a monkey that does an action and a neuron fires, and then another monkey sees an action and neurons fire. So at the end of the day, we really can't tell the difference between whether we are doing something and somebody else does something. We can't easily tell the difference, which is why when we're watching sports and your favorite football player is almost about to score, you feel what an attenuated or a smaller version of what that person feels, right? So that's why you get so engaged in the game. So we're kind of we have this image, or rather two images, one image of how we see ourselves and one image of how the world sees us. And we're constantly in a flux, which means that it's not like there's a static middle ground that we're at. It's constant flux. Sometimes we see ourselves more as how others see us. Sometimes we become more individual, and it really depends on how much isolation we get. If you're constantly around people, you will always see yourself as how they see you. But if you're constantly isolated, you will always see yourself as how you see yourself. But the truth is, neither is good for you. You need to be somewhere in the middle, and sometimes you can tip to either side. This is not a constant. Then there's the idea of self-awareness. Every time we feel an emotion, being self-aware and self-observing radically changes how the brain works. Most people don't do this. Most people don't label their emotions. They label their thoughts, but they don't label the underlying emotion or the underlying current below it. So every time we take a second to label the emotion we're feeling, I'm feeling angry, I am feeling sad, I am feeling hungry, I am feeling upset. When we label the emotion, we strengthen the rational part of the brain. And this is practice, right? Most of our thoughts are impulsive. And we know that the impulsive thoughts are because of system 1, right? It rushes to something, it's fast. When we are not being rational. The brain resolves this via something called backward rationalization, making us believe that we were in control of our actions. So we know there's no free will, but the brain convinces you that there was free will. You took that decision. You took a rational decision. But the truth is, you probably didn't. In many situations, you might have gotten into a fight, you might have been very angry, and you might have said some hateful things to the other person. And the other person would go back and think, this person said hateful things to me, which means that this person has all these feelings harbored towards me. And you, because you've said all these hateful things, now via backward rationalization, you start believing that you actually hate that other person. But the truth is, the underlying current was just anger, right? You said these things out of anger, but you've now tricked yourself into believing that you actually whatever words you said, maybe you said that person is lazy. Right? Now you actually believe that that person is lazy because you've said it, right? The brain believes what actions you do. So if you behave in a certain way, the brain starts believing that you are that way. So your actions, your brain looks at your actions. Remember, two different entities, your system 1 and system 2. System 2 looks at the actions that system 1 makes and says, maybe I am like that. I do that a lot. Maybe I am like that, right? So that happens a lot. Our brain then justifies why we behave irrationally, and this is called cognitive dissonance. So if you've labeled someone lazy and internally you're like, I'm not sure if that person's lazy, but now that you've gone out and publicly called that person lazy, you'll tell yourself, I call that person lazy, so maybe I do think that person is lazy, right? And that's cognitive dissonance. When you have or show a behavior and you have some conflicting thoughts, now because you've shown that behavior, your brain believes that that thought that associated with the behavior is true. Now I want to talk about the brain as a whole. What you think is a unity. You might think, hey, I am XYZ, or I might think, oh, I am Varun Maya, is actually a bunch of neurons firing in different configurations. It's like the pixels on your screen, right? And look at these images on the left. They're pixels on a screen. You can take and rearrange those pixels to show one image, or you can rearrange those pixels to show a different image, right? At the end of the day, it's still pixels. So you're a blank slate, your behaviors are a blank slate, and you can be in different configurations at different times. You are actually different people in different situations and with different types of trainings with a loose connection to the last person you were. So it's not as radical a change as you can see in the image on the left. You don't go from that cartoon character to this cartoon character. You actually change slightly depending on the environment. So every day you're a slightly different person from the previous day. So if you want to change yourself completely as a person, it takes time because you can't radically change yourself. We know this from diseased brain states, like split brain patients, right? We know they exhibit a lot of behaviors that are very, very different from what they used to be just before their brain got split. So there's a part of the brain in the middle which relays information from the left to the right brain, right? Or the right brain to the left brain. When that part is severed, the people don't even know what's wrong with them. They're just new people, and their pixel manufacturing system, the representation that you see on the left is spoiled. Imagine the screen gets broken in half, right? There's a crack on the screen. The person who's inside doesn't know there's a crack on the screen, right? So all the behaviors that are exhibited are still exhibited through that crack, but the person doesn't know there's a crack. So split brain patients can't tell that they're actually behaving very differently from what they used to be because they are inside the system. So cognitive dissonance. It's the stress a person experiences when they hold opposing beliefs at the same time in the brain. Remember I told you that example of somebody going out and getting angry at somebody and calling that person lazy just because they were angry, they said something and they said that person was lazy. Now there's stress. You said that person was lazy and now you have to own up to it. If you weren't sure in your brain whether the person is lazy or not, because you've gone and exhibited the behavior of calling that person lazy, now you don't want to be looked at as a bad person. Now you don't want to be looked at as an inconsistent person. Cognitive dissonance happens because people don't want to be seen as inconsistent, right? So you go out, you've called this person lazy. Now you don't want to track back on your word. It looks bad publicly, right? It looks bad internally. Remember, your other brain is watching. So now you have decided that this person is lazy and you think that this person is lazy. And because you've exhibited the behavior now, you believe that this person is lazy. And you trick both brains. Both brains like being in sync. Right? So you've convinced yourself that this person is lazy. An example of this is smokers. People know smoking is bad and yet they smoke. So you can look at the image on the left. The same person is saying, I'm a smoker. And on the other hand, he holds a conflicting belief, which is smoking causes cancer. Now, how does the brain resolve this conflict? Two opposing thoughts. My action is that I smoke and my thought process is that smoking causes cancer. Why am I doing something bad? And then the brain rationalizes it. It changes the behavior of the cognition, which is, I'm not going to smoke anymore, which is the fact that smoking causes cancer, that idea wins. Or it justifies the behavior of the cognition by changing the second conflicting cognition. I'm allowed to smoke once in a while. It's not that bad. This is ways you're convincing the other brain. Justify the behavior of the cognition by adding new cognitions, which is, I'll smoke today, but not tomorrow. You're trying to bargain with the other brain. Ignore or deny information that conflicts with existing beliefs, which is smoking is not really bad for health. The reports are exaggerated. You're trying to convince yourself that, I'm doing a behavior, but it's fine. There's nothing that bad about the behavior. Maybe the reports are exaggerated, right? So you have to lean onto one side. And once you start leaning onto one side, you start justifying it. So the words that come out of your mouth are a result of the behaviors you exhibit, right? It's actually both ways, right? And you have to understand that. And we've understood this from CBT when we've studied it through the Calm India part of the course. Your behaviors, your actions, and your thoughts are very, very close together. You can either manipulate your thoughts, but the best way to go about is to manipulate your behaviors. So, willpower is merely the drive to reduce cognitive dissonance. When you have willpower and you're doing these conflicting things, it's the ability to choose one of the two things. Because you can get stuck in cognitive dissonance, your brain chooses one, but for you to say, my brain has chosen the wrong decision, I'm going to exert willpower and go back to the right decision, right? Smoking causes cancer, but I'm still smoking. Let's go back to the right decision, which is let's quit cigarettes, right? So this is the idea behind willpower. Now, seeing your activity as yours alone while ignoring your environment is a mistake. So I've told you this, between the moment that we are born and the moment that we die, we are environmentally driven. Until then, just before you're born, it's your genes that make you, your structure, the way you process things, your resilience, that's your genes. But beyond that, it's purely your environment at play. So seeing your activity as yours alone while completely ignoring your environment is a mistake. Having empathy for everyone, including understanding that the most horrendous people, including thieves and murderers, were pushed by their environment and circumstances to do what they did, is a hallmark of intelligence. To understand that most people, including people who are crazy or very successful or unsuccessful or poor, they're all products of their environment. And that's true intelligence, right? To understand that at the end of the day, everyone is where they are because of the way that their environment was. And like we've mentioned before, there's no such thing as free will. Most people in the 1800s who were classified as thieves were actually, really poor people who didn't have enough bread to make it to the next day. And because of their environment, because of a crazy amount of hunger and the pressure from their maybe siblings to go out and steal some food, that's what they ended up doing. They ended up doing it out of desperation. Right now, I'm not saying these are good people or bad people, right? Going to jail for a crime that you committed is still, it's a socially or an environmental way of correcting you, right? So at the end of the day, it's still an environmentally driven process. So the reason you became good or bad, or take the example of somebody successful, a lot of successful people have been in environments that have encouraged them and at the same time given them the ability to rise up from adversity. When you make it a habit to rise up from adversity, when you fall, when you make it a habit to pick yourself up, or your environment does that for you, or your environment comes and picks you up a couple of times and helps you but doesn't help you too much, then you become somebody who's able to handle things on your own. And most successful entrepreneurs have had this good fortune. I've had, when I was young, even though we didn't have the best of times, I had an environment which was fairly supportive, which picked me up but didn't help me too much. There's a lot of parents help their children beyond a certain point, and that makes the children incapable of handling things on their own. But in a situation like this, in my situation, I had somebody who could help me up, but at the same time didn't help me up or didn't have the resources to help me up enough for me to completely depend on them. And after a while, I was on my own. I had a little bit of training with being helped up for the first few years, and after that I was completely on my own, and over time I came to a point where I could pick myself up in any situation. But I don't forget the fact that it was my environment that helped me do this in the early days, that trained me to do this, right? So ideally, you do not have free will and cannot change your environment without a cue. So if you're stuck doing whatever you're doing, you can't change unless you change your environment, or at least you're told to change your environment. Watching this episode, surprisingly, is a cue or a reminder that you can change your environment. If you're waiting for a sign, this is it, right? You possibly would never have changed your environment without this episode, but now that you're watching this episode, here's a quick reminder. You can change your environment, right? You can change everything around you, the people around you, and that will change who you are. I keep saying this, but if you want to become a boxer, you don't join a boxing class. You hang around with people who are boxers, who constantly remind you through a social validation game that the right type of person to be is a good boxer. Because all the other guys are always talking about boxing, you will feel like you don't fit in if you don't also talk about boxing, right? That's how you become a boxer. If you want to get fit, if you want to build muscles, you need to hang around people who are fit. Because then looking at them, you'll always feel a little bit inadequate. And because of that, you'll work hard and build your own muscle. Now, with the internet, we have the ability to consume content from very specific people, right? If we want to become like somebody, we consume their content on the internet. So if a professor is teaching you mathematics, then at the end of the day, if you consume their content on the internet, then you will end up becoming a professor of mathematics, right? You won't become somebody who implements mathematics. But if you follow somebody who is a particular way, then you will be more and more like that person, right? So you will become like the people you follow. So the only thing you're going to get by following a professor who just teaches is you will become a professor who just teaches, right? So try to follow a lot of people who are doing real things with their life that you want to be like, and make sure that those are the only people they're following, because eventually those will become your yardsticks of, you'll be like, okay, that's my definition of success. These are the things that I should do. Whereas if you follow 100 of your unsuccessful and lazy friends, then you will end up becoming like those people. Because like I told you, they are not to blame for where they are. It's their environment that made them who they are. Maybe they have really rich parents. Maybe they've just not been given the opportunity to have adversity. It doesn't matter. We are mimicking creatures. We have mirror neurons. We become like the people we follow. We become like the people we hang around with. And this episode is your cue to change your environment and change the people you hang out with and change the kind of content you consume, because you will become like those people. Choose wisely. So I have a couple of closing thoughts, right? This is a picture from the book called Flow, which is that it's a graph of your challenges and your abilities, right? And this is about system 1 and system 2. When your ability is low, which means that you have to do everything through system 2, then when your challenge is low, you just feel sad and depressed. You feel apathy. You don't care about it enough. But as your abilities improve, as it becomes system 1 and the challenge level is still low, it becomes relaxation, right? A good example of this is when I do design. I'm reasonably good with design. It's a system 1 process for me now. And the challenge level is reasonably low for somebody like me. If I'm making some simple design, maybe I'm just making a cutout. That's easy. I can do it brainlessly. It's relaxation. Whereas if the challenge level is high and it's really high and my abilities are low, then I get anxiety, right? If I have to, let me tell you something about when my ability is low and my challenge level is high. Swimming. I'm not a good swimmer. I can't even swim properly, right? And the challenge level in swimming in an ocean is extremely high. So if you threw me in an ocean, I would have an incredible amount of anxiety because I do not know how to swim, and the challenge level is really high because the repercussion is I will drown, right? So the anxiety goes high. But if my abilities are really high and my challenge level is really high, then I go into a state of flow. When I play the game of Dota, which is an incredibly challenging game, it's a competitive game, but my abilities have been honed over the last decade, actually more than that, then I am in a state of flow. And the goal is to try to be in a state of flow all the time. So if I were you, I would try to find a job that puts you at maximum in a state of flow. In most jobs, you can't be in a state of flow all the time, but you can try to find a job that puts you in a state of flow at least 70 or 80% of the time. Coding is a good example. Complex design is a good example. If you're working at a newspaper and your job is to cut celebrities out, that's a boring job. That's a low challenge job. It requires ability, but it's a low challenge job. So you probably relaxed. But if you want flow in the design field, you need to do complex stuff. You need to make composites. You need to make art, right? So that's what being in flow is. The compulsive need to impose expectations seems to be a mistake, right? We always put these expectations on ourselves without understanding that's a lot to do with the environment and not so much to do with us. Lack of attachment to a story or a narrative of ourselves seems to yield a more accurate version of the situation. So remember that situation where we got angry and we called somebody lazy? If we don't try to create a narrative around the situation and we look at it from a zoomed out perspective, we could tell that, this person was angry and because of that, this person said these bad words. Instead of making a story around it and saying, I said these words, so it's true. We can actually zoom out and to look at an accurate version of the situation, because situations are complex, but the human brain tends to make stories out of everything, right? The media essentially does that, right? The media makes stories of everything. But the truth is, most situations are complex and you should try to look at the actual situation. Seeing your life as a series of projects with you, becoming mostly different people in different projects is a better way to approach life. When I did JobSpire, even though I am kind of the same person, it was a different me compared to the me that's doing Avalon, right? When I did Sizer, which was my early freelance days, that was a completely different me. Even though we share the same body, our brains have a lot of overlap. The same design skills that I had in Sizer are the design skills I use today. Those parts are similar, but a lot has changed. And instead of me calling it all Varun, the same Varun, and saying, this is my narrative, this is my story, I only use that to explain it to other people. But in reality, I know that these are different phases of my life, and there are clear or not so clear demarcations between each phase. I've learned something important in each phase of my life, right? So growth, validation, and its evolutionary side effects like happiness and fulfillment are most stimulated when we aren't being labeled in our interactions, which means when we talk to each other, we shouldn't be labeling this as a good interaction or a bad interaction. Instead, we should label the underlying emotion. Was I angry in that situation? Was I sad in that situation? That's smarter than actually labeling the situation itself. Don't look at the surface level stuff. Look underneath the surface. Although we have disagreements in our daily interactions, having a rational, open mind and exercising that, free from compulsive labeling things that are above the surface, looking at the underlying currents and expressing yourself with a degree of emotional regulation allows us to enjoy life to its maximum potential, right? That's basically the crux of what we're trying to get to. Being in a goalless, focused state of flow seems to be when humans are happiest. That's why I said happiness is temporary, because you can't be in flow all the time. Sometimes you need to go out and buy groceries. Sometimes you need to go out and have a hard conversation with somebody. You can't be in flow in those situations, which is why you can't be happy all the time. But you can choose to be happy 70% of the time, 60% of the time. That's a reasonable ask, right? And those are mostly in situations where you lose yourself, right? And those are situations where I feel happiest. When I play Dota, it's my character. I become my character during that period. When I'm doing design, the only thing I can think about is how to crop that properly, or how to change the color, or how to make it what I'm thinking about. I'm not thinking about myself or my story during that period. When I play Dota, I'm not thinking about myself or my story. And a lot of people who go into depression are always thinking about themselves and their story at a point, and then not going into flow, right? So being in a goalless, which is stories need goals, and if you throw away the story for a while and be in a focused state of flow, that seems to be when you will be the happiest, right? And this is according to current research. The human social network is a global network of neurochemical reactions. This is not to trivialize its complexity or value. This is not to say that this is small or simple, but we are just basically a big network of neurochemical reactions. We're just 100 billion neurons times the number of people in the world. With openness, skepticism, and the scientific method, we can live healthy social lives with each other. The question isn't about which of our beliefs are right or wrong, right? Like I told you, there's no such thing as right or wrong. This is all environmentally driven. But whether being emotionally attached to them is going to benefit us or not as a collective, right? So when we look at the underlying label and we say this came out of anger, then should we be attached to the fact that we call that person lazy? Is that even important, right? Is that something that is rational? The moment we become aware of this, we can work together for advancement of the human race. When we start looking at the underlying currents, are people feeling left out? Are they angry? Are they sad? Instead of looking at what they said, which is often not completely true. It's just an underlying current coming out in some other way. If we become aware of this, we can work together for advancement of the human race. Remember, feeling emotions does not mean you are human. Feeling emotions means you have a limbic system. The older part of the brain is called the limbic system, and the newer part of the brain is called the neocortex. Feeling emotions means that you have a limbic system which evolved at around the same time as the regions for temperature control and homeostasis, which means it's a very, very, very old system. Temperature control, you know what that is. That's very, very, very old. We'd find that in some primitive creatures. And homeostasis, which is the ability to keep all the other systems in a reasonable state, in a normal state. So the temperature doesn't go too high, doesn't go too low, our breathing doesn't go too fast, doesn't go too slow. The balance systems, very, very old systems. That is when emotions came about. The ability to run away from predators. That's where fear came from. The ability to look at unfairness and say that is good or that is bad. That is where anger came from, right? These emotions are very primitive. In fact, humans are mainly differentiated from other animals thanks to the recently evolved neocortex, which is the seat of rationality, right? Things like language, creation, art, these are all new parts of the brain. These are what we should be exercising. These are what makes us human, not emotions. There are a lot of people who will come and tell you, feel the emotions, that's what makes you human, but that is rubbish. The research does not support that. The research supports that what makes you truly human is your rationality, your ability to exercise rationality. What makes us truly human is our ability to exercise rationality over emotions. Right? When you experience emotions, it means that you're being an animal. That's not a bad thing. It doesn't mean that's a bad thing. You can experience being an animal and being a human at the same time because there are two parts of your brain and it's okay to satisfy both. It's just find the right balance for yourself. What makes us truly human, and I'm going to repeat this for the third time, is our ability to exercise rationality over emotion. Well, that's been a fantastic ride, right? I mean, you guys have learned about the brain. I spent a lot of time doing research about this. I've spent time at cognitive labs trying to get this together. And it seems that there's a lot of potential for us to improve now with the access to the internet, because I learned how to think, or I learned how to change my thought patterns because of a lot of influential people in my life who helped me, who spent the time out to help me. Now, I know not everybody has access to that. Not everybody has access to somebody who's made it, who has learned all of these things through hardship and adversity, who can spend their time and teach you all of these things. I was lucky in a certain way. So, everything that I'm doing with these videos is trying to help some people from things that I've learned, and I'm making sure that things that I've learned are not crap. They're not correlation, and not causation. I'm trying to figure out things that actually caused my life to fall into place, right? So combining my experiences and the people that have helped me with science and actual research has put this out, and I want this to be free, at least the basics part of the course, so that I give the same basics that somebody else gave me, right? So all I have to leave you with, and I'm going to repeat it for the fourth time, what makes us truly human is our ability to exercise rationality over emotion. But that doesn't mean you let emotions go, right? You still feel them, you experience them, but never call them what makes you human, because that is scientifically wrong. All right, guys, thank you for joining me. It's been a wonderful ride, and hopefully we get to add an advanced part of this as I do more and more research. That's going to take me some time. Our standards for putting things in this course, it's high. Give us some time. We'll be out with the new content. But so far, I hope you loved this. Adios.